Let's jump right into this. If you love digging past those surface-level narratives to understand the actual mechanics of history, you are in the exact right place for this explainer. Today, we're breaking down a fascinating tension: how the myths that sustain a national identity often clash directly with the messy truths of history. To get started, let's look at this beautiful metaphor from our source material, the idea of America as a crazy quilt. You know, velvet and calico, checks and brocades. These are totally discordant fabrics that shouldn't really make sense together, but somehow they do. And that perfectly captures how America is stitched together. It's built not on seamless uniformity, but on a collection of shared and honestly, sometimes completely contradictory beliefs that somehow form a unified whole.
Which brings us to the core theme we're exploring today. America operates on a set of profoundly contradictory ideas. We're going to systematically examine this persistent gap. We'll look at the myths that have defined the American identity for nearly 2.5 centuries, and then we'll place them right next to the objective historical truths that actively challenge those very myths.
Okay, Section 1, the American Dream. Promise or mirage? Columbia University economist Joseph E. Stiglitz frames this concept pretty bluntly. He says the American dream is largely a myth, and he's not just throwing an opinion out there. He points directly to the data. According to OECD data highlighted in the sources, the United States actually ranks as the worst-performing country among its peers when it comes to equality of opportunity. So, that old promise that anyone can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, it simply doesn't align with the economic realities that economists are measuring today.
And you know, current public sentiment really reflects this shift. Just look at this 2026 CNBC poll. A full 51% of U.S. adults say the American dream is completely out of reach. Another 43% say it's achievable for some, and 6% feel it's not in reach for literally anyone. The source material points out that things like soaring inflation, staggering student debt, and widening inequality have totally shifted how the public sees this. What was once considered a basic birthright is now viewed by the majority as an inaccessible mirage.
But the really crucial point here is this stark figure: 25%. Out of that entire survey, only 25% of people believed they actually had a good chance to improve their standard of living. Why does that matter so much? Because according to the data, that is the lowest that figure has been since the survey began way back in 1987. That represents a profound shift in the psychological fabric of the nation. Moving on to Section 2, American Exceptionalism. Special or diluted? So, the popular myth champions this idea of unique moral virtue, that America provides altruistic leadership and is destined to spread liberty worldwide. But historians paint a very different reality. They argued that the country's creation involved massive expropriation, and that its post-war global actions were often calculated necessities aimed strictly at maintaining global superpower dominance rather than acting purely out of altruism. Scholar David Michael Smith captures this tension powerfully. He writes, "Manifold forms of mass death have been indispensable to the American story. Exceptionalism is a dangerous myth." And this sums up exactly how many scholars view the exceptionalism myth today, not just as harmless patriotism, but as a fantasy that obscures a much more complicated and sometimes ethically repugnant historical record. It essentially allows a nation to see itself as the perpetual hero of history, completely bypassing its darker, more difficult chapters. All right, Section 3, the frontier. Rugged individualism or government help? The myth of the rugged individualist, the tough, self-reliant lone cowboy carving civilization out of the wilderness, is a massive part of the American identity. But as historians point out, this narrative almost entirely ignores the foundational role of collective action and extensive federal government intervention. The reality of the frontier was actually far more cooperative and heavily subsidized than the legends ever suggest. Let's quickly walk through some specific examples from our sources to prove this point. The actual engines of Western expansion were things like mutual protective associations and local claim clubs, which heavily rewarded cooperation over isolation. Then you have massive federal interventions. We're talking the Homestead Act giving away federal land, huge subsidies for the Transcontinental Railroad, and of course federal military campaigns that cleared Native American lands. The lone pioneer definitely didn't do it alone. They did it backed by the full weight of the federal government. Which brings us to Section 4, the founding. Christian nation or secular republic? Using historian Stephen K. Green's analysis, we can actually trace exactly when and how the narrative of a Christian America was invented, because it wasn't an automatic fact of the founding. Green identifies 3 specific moments: the Puritan era in the 17th century, the American Revolution in the 18th century, and early 1800s interpretations. In these periods, a religious narrative was aggressively imposed upon the actual historical facts to create a cohesive national myth. If you want to understand the actual historical facts, this number might really surprise you. 0. That is the exact number of times the word God is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. It's a striking reminder that the founding generation was actually heavily divided. It was filled with deists, skeptics, and Enlightenment thinkers who deliberately designed a secular framework for the Republic rather than a strictly religious one.
Let's look at Section 5, Equality. All men are created equal. This reveals what is arguably the ultimate tension at the heart of the country's founding. Thomas Jefferson penned that soaring Enlightenment ideal, all men are created equal, a phrase that has literally inspired legitimate freedom movements all over the globe. Yet the author of those words personally owned over 600 human beings. The Republic's high-minded rhetoric of inherent liberty was constructed squarely on a foundation of slavery and indigenous displacement. As our source material points out, that famous phrase was originally intended as a political statement, not a universal reality.
And the crucial takeaway here is that the Republic was never held together solely by constitutional law. It was held together by a myth, a shared, perhaps slightly diluted belief in basic decency, and the idea that institutional norms would ultimately prevail. That mythological glue has been absolutely essential for holding the American experiment together through centuries of pretty brutal internal contradictions.
Okay, Section 6. Stitching it all together, reconciling myth and reality. I want to share this urgent warning from historians Kevin Kruse and Julian Zelizer. They argue that the United States is currently in the grip of a crisis of bad history. What we really need to take away from this is the severe danger of embracing myths uncritically. When inaccurate interpretations and outright misrepresentations of the past take over, they do serious damage to public discourse. Basically, we can't solve modern problems if we're using fake historical maps to navigate them.
Yet, we don't necessarily need to throw out the ideals completely. As Mario Cuomo beautifully put it, this is a nation founded on a conundrum, community added to individualism. These two ideals are constantly pulling in opposite directions, but the tension between them isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's the very engine of American progress that forces society to keep moving forward. And you can see this engine of progress throughout history. The true history of America is messy, for sure, but it's deeply defined by generations of people using the nation's foundational myths as leverage to demand that the reality actually be fulfilled. Enslaved people demanding freedom, women demanding the right to vote, workers demanding dignity, and immigrants demanding opportunity. They all looked at the glaring gap between the myth and the truth, and they forced the country to stitch those pieces closer together.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and leaves us with a pretty provocative question. Can America truly reconcile its myths with its realities? As we've seen today, that crazy quilt is full of glaring contradictions. So I invite you to reflect on everything we just covered, and ask yourself if this endlessly renewable, deeply imperfect idea can ever truly form a more perfect union. Thanks so much for joining me to explore this today. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the data, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.